Welcome back to Chicago Crossing Model Railroad. Eric here with you for another edition of At the Bench. And today, as you can see here in my hands, I've got the Cassidy Tires warehouse building, plucked it off of the rear left side of the layout for some reinvention and reinvigoration. This building is a very loose representation of the real thing, which was built back in 1902, was for a while owned by the Chicago Northwestern Railroad and then became the Cassidy Tires warehouse in 1970. It was demolished, just a few years ago, actually, to make way for a large high-rise structure. So the kit that I'm using is really nothing like the original Cassidy Tires warehouse. This is, if you probably have seen it before, it's the American Hardware Supply kit. Architecturally speaking, it's a lot later than Cassidy Tires, probably by at least a decade or two. Cassidy was built in what is known as the Chicago commercial style. This is essentially a neo-Gothic Art Deco structure. You can tell by the way the corners of the building look, but a lot of it's the same in terms of concrete load-bearing structure. So it's all ironwork encased in concrete. But in any case, what you can tell here is this building was done pretty simplistically. I used a thin burnt umber com art paint for the brick. The roof is just gray, kind of like you see there. And, there's really nothing to recommend to this thing. I mean, it's competently built, will require a little bit of updating in terms of skills and a lot of dusting, as you can kind of tell. So there's a fair bit to do here. I've taken all of the stuff off of the roof in preparation for a lot of work on this building. So the big objective here is to actually make this building look its age. In the year of the layout, the Cassidy Tires warehouse would be, getting close to a century old. And there's no way that a century-old building looks like this. So it's worth taking the time to actually think about how things like concrete and how windows, brick, etc., all age on a building like this, and how buildings, even warehouse buildings like this that seem fairly generic, will actually be adapted or changed over time in order to fit the needs of whomever happens to own the thing. One of those adaptations is really evident in how windows are used in these buildings. If you look at the Cassidy warehouse, you notice that almost all of the windows on the floor above the entrance have been covered over with cinder block. Many of other windows have been bricked over or partially bricked over in order to incorporate a smaller window. And if you look at contemporaneous buildings in Chicago, you also notice that these glass panes usually are not simply replaced with glass when they're broken. They're either patched over, replaced with fiberglass panels, other things like that. And those features really create the sense of age for these sorts of buildings, as well as the sense of adaptation for other uses. This is going to be a multi-part series, no doubt, because this building needs some careful renovation or restoration to make it look just the age I want it to. What we'll do today is we'll actually just get started working with the brickwork in order to update that to my technical skills at this point. And from there, we'll get to all the other cool stuff in other episodes. A long while back on Chicago Crossing, I talked about how I do mortar joints in buildings. And of course, here we're looking at a building that's already assembled. Always makes things a little bit more complicated. But nonetheless, my approach, and again, this may not be your approach, but it is mine, is I'm going to use buff Tamiya paint, highly diluted. And basically, this can just be used in order to snake in via capillary action into all of the joints underneath the brick. And so essentially what I'm doing here is just flowing on this dilute pigment. Tamiya paint is beautiful when it comes to quality of the pigment. And what happens is it basically just flows in between the bricks. You obviously do get some coloration of the brick itself, but much like I showed in that initial video, this is a easy way to start to create some lightening color of those mortar joints. Now, to look most effective, typically this approach needs a few different passes. In other words, the reason the mortar joints look so good now is because that's a liquid in there. As that liquid dries, it will contract down, and so the degree of pigment in there looks a lot smaller once it dries. So I'll usually come back for brick like this maybe 2 or 3, sometimes even 4 times in order just to get it to look just right. At that point, there's enough pigment in there so that the mortar joints look good. Other folks will use materials with space filling capacities, and that includes even thicker craft pigments and stuff like that, and they'll wipe it off afterwards. That approach is doable. I'll actually be using that for some of the brick applique that I use later. But I really like this approach just for the amount of control, and especially in a building like this that's already pre-assembled. Pretty much any time that you try to fill in the mortar joints after painting the brick, you will invariably change the color of the brick. You will lighten it up, and that is true with my approach too. So there's a couple of different approaches to increase the contrast, which also allows you to see the mortar joints better. So it's not just an issue of, oh, I need to get the brick back to a color. It's actually an issue of creating the contrast between the mortar and the brick such that you can tell that there is a mortar joint in there. So the approach I'm using here is likewise what I'd shown before, which is basically dry brushing with a very dark pigment. In this case, because this was already a dark brick building, I'm using dark rust Vallejo paint. And I'm not using the Vallejo Air, I'm actually just using the thicker Vallejo pigment. I'm taking almost all of the paint off of there, and that is allowing me to basically just brush somewhat gently the top of the brick in order to make sure I'm not coloring in the joints, but rather just coloring the brick. And the other thing is, brick is highly variable. Depending on the masons who put it together, there's all sorts of changes in the lot of the brick and stuff like that. So on a large curtain wall like this that's just brick, you're going to have a lot of different color variations. And, it doesn't show obviously here because the camera's panned out, but when you come back in a little closer, you really will notice the difference. Another approach that I've also used, especially for some of these areas that are less amenable to dry brushing, is AK weathering pencils. I remember I mentioned a little while ago it was not exactly clear what I could use these for, and so I've been exploring uses. Well, this is actually a really good one. The key to this technique is using extremely gentle pressure. The only thing you want to do is apply the pigment to the top of the brick. You don't want any pigment shearing off and ending up in the mortar joints. Otherwise, it more or less undermines what you're trying to do to begin with. So, light touches. This is one of the darker brown colors. The chipping color in the pencil set is also really good. And yeah, it's, stay within the lines. It's almost like you're a kid again, coloring with pencils or crayons or something like that. And coming back, actually with just a little bit of a different color pigment. One thing to note about the AK pencils is before you do any sort of wet on wet technique or even coming back with other colors, it's best to clear coat that in order to protect it and to keep it from sloughing off or getting diluted. It is essentially an acrylic pigment. It's not like a graphite pencil or something like that. And so you do have to be careful. But here what I'm doing is basically taking a dark rust color. I've got it very, very minimally applied to this brush, and then I'm just kind of feathering over some of the areas that I'd already worked with the pencils. And this is basically just adding more variety to the color of the brick. Again, brick is kind of an interesting thing to model because it is every color and no color. In fact, a lot of brick in Chicago is actually almost black in color, particularly the non-facing brick. So I've given the building a clear coat in order to seal in everything that I've done with the AK pencils and with the dry brushing and so forth. Looks really good. So now it's time to come over to the concrete. Concrete is another really interesting material to model, and a really challenging one to model as well, because it is almost every color and it's no color. And as it ages, it undergoes a lot of chemical and physical changes that will add even further variety to the model. So in this case, what I'm doing is basically modeling some of the cracking and spalling that occurs as concrete ages. And I'm using a sponge chipping technique similar to what you might use to create rust. Here the color is basically a very dark gray. You can even use something similar to like a Panzer black brown from Vallejo, and that'll work really well too. So the key here is basically just careful application. The sponge chipping technique is good because it will typically accentuate edges. That's where the sponge will compress, and so that's where you're going to be more likely to get an effect. And that's actually great because that's really where you want it. This is mostly resembling the cracking and chipping and spalling of concrete after all. Now's the fun part, which is the wet on wet painting. I'm going to start out here using basically a Vallejo beige brown, and for all of my wet on wet approaches I use Vallejo paint. It is easily mixable in water, and that creates a really nice effect. So I'm basically just brushing out the concrete with water, as you can see here. And then I'll come back in with a small brush, starting out in this case with kind of a beige brown color from Vallejo, and we'll see how that goes on. This really is, and I've mentioned this before, it's sort of one of the lowest stakes, highest reward forms of painting you can do, because anything you see that you don't like when you apply the paint, you just add water to it or you move the paint around, and that unwanted effect disappears. The other thing I like about it is there's an element of serendipity to it, and what that means is you're often going to get happy accidents that actually look the way you do want them. Coming back now with some dark gray. Dark gray is really nice because it provides some more staining or dirt effects on the concrete. I don't like to just, slather India ink or something like that on these buildings because, it's not just a matter of dirt accumulation. As buildings age, they change chemically and otherwise. And so being able to model those effects carefully and thoughtfully, I think in this case is really, really useful. It just helps to add that depth of character to the building. Now coming back with Middlestone, you can use a variety of colors here. And, the addition or subtraction of colors is more or less just up to what your interests are or how deeply you're trying to model some of these effects on buildings. For me, I have so much fun doing this that honestly I'll use 5 or 6 or sometimes even 7 colors, maybe just go a couple of rounds on it to just get the depth of effect I want. And that's totally fine. You may want to use more or less depending. but I actually really enjoy this form of painting. I find it to be incredibly relaxing and incredibly satisfying in terms of the depth of effect. So your mileage may vary on what you choose for a project like this. For me, I'm happy to just kind of take it to the next level and to really explore how these different colors will mix together in order to create the aging effect on concrete. So I've been coming back with concrete, as you saw. You're probably wondering, why did I not use concrete to begin with, since the building is colored concrete? But keep in mind, again, it's always concrete has many different colors. So I'm coming back to the foundation here and basically creating illusions of moisture or mold accumulation. I've also got some darker greens that I'll come back here to build up as well. You know, if this area of the building is not exposed to the sun so much, then you can get these kind of water stains and things like that. So once the building dries, once I'm done playing with pigments here, then essentially it'll get clear coated. And at that point, it will be ready for all of the other modifications that I intend to make to it, including bricking and blocking of windows, other modifications to the roof and the roof furniture, introduction of some post hoc HVAC units and things like that. But, you know, once it's all done, it's really the close-up where you get the nice view of all of this effort. And you can really see nice mortar joints. You can see variety to the concrete. It really just shows the age of the building, and it makes the building appear so much more in place with its time on my layout. So really happy with this result. Thanks for joining for this edition of Chicago Crossing at the Bench. I'll come back with part 2, looking at some of the modifications to the windows and walls.